So usually in Java, they will do a tape script, right? So you like assign the tape, you get tape.
Our next talk is by Isha Tripathi. What you love about Ruby but didn't know.
Hello, my name's Isha. I work for ThoughtWorks in India, and this is my first time presenting a technical topic at an international conference, so I am massively nervous. Also, in the spirit of full disclosure and for a few disclaimers, I'd like to know how many of you in this group identify as beginners when it comes to Ruby. I'm raising my hand because I consider myself a beginner, so don't be scared, please. So, the reason I ask is my relationship with Ruby, so to say, has been fairly casual since we got introduced about 4 years ago. So I've been experimenting on and off with a bunch of things and, doing a course here, some contributions there, never actively involved in writing production code. So it never reached a stage where we were exclusive, mostly casual, as I said. So for a lot of you, this might be more of a refresher than sort of things you love about Ruby. These are things I love about Ruby and like to talk about, so hence the topic. Also, please be kind. I'm, like I said, a beginner, so, keep that in mind. So to start with, Wikipedia defines Ruby as a dynamic, reflective, object-oriented, general-purpose programming language. Very straightforward, but also pretty boring. For those of us who are familiar with Ruby, this doesn't really capture the essence so much, right? So, I'd like to use a few different quotes to define what sort of Ruby means to me as well. In the words of maths, Ruby is simple in appearance but complex inside, very much like the human body. When I first got introduced to Ruby, it was like, oh my god, there is so much I can do with this, and I had no idea how it does it. And like, okay, I don't really care either because it lets me do it. Also, in the words of DHH, where he wrote this in the Rails doctrine, Ruby's original RC was indeed to place the happiness of the programmer on a pedestal, right? And that's what another thing I really like about Ruby is that it's so much easier to write than, for example, Java that I've been working on for the last few months. Well, months is an understatement, but a while now. And every time I write some really convoluted piece of code, I'm like, damn, this would be so easy if I was writing this in Ruby. But that doesn't always happen. And also when I first got introduced to programming was when I was in 4th grade and we used to write logo programs with this tiny little cursor where you just write a command and it moves around on the screen. So, yeah. Logo for the win. So that's when it all started, that's when my love for programming started as well. And when I got introduced to Ruby, it was like a magical new world where everything was so simple as opposed to any other language I'd ever worked on. So I would even extend that to say not just the programmer, but even the one reading and maintaining that code, it makes their life so much easier. So, before, I just stop talking so much about how much I love Ruby and move on to what I actually want to talk about. So, let's say you have this class account, which doesn't have anything at the moment. It has a few attributes called, say, customer name, account, type of account, balance. It could have a bunch of other things. It also has this private method that is called encrypt, so probably, hopefully, it encrypts something that you pass to it. And I want to be able to write something that does, okay, account dot get me the encrypted balance, and I would say balance encrypted. Of course, I could write it as account dot get encrypted and pass a balance parameter to it, but that's dependent on what I name my parameter. I want to make it very, very explicit that I want the encrypted balance to be sent back to me. I might want to do the same for, say, amount or type of account or any other parameter that may or may not be defined on my amount class, right? So either I could go ahead and start writing methods that will do all of this for me, or I could use, say, a method missing and pass it a bunch of different things, say, okay, if it matches encrypted, and if it has underscore encrypted in the name, then just go define it on that class, and in the future, I can call it however I want. This is, of course, a very, very simple representation of what one might actually do, but it lets you do that, right? So, and that's a huge, that's just an introduction to all this metaprogramming magic that Ruby gives you. There's so much it lets you do, and this is just one part of it, right? In words of this article that I was reading by Lee Halliday, it's sort of like a begin rescue, but for method calls, which pretty much sums up method missing. So it takes in a method name as a symbol, bunch of arguments, takes in a block, and lets you do something that is the default behavior of your class. And alternatively, even add dynamic behavior to your classes, right? Does this sound familiar, dynamically adding methods to your classes, or dynamically adding behavior to your classes? Yeah? Right, so ActiveRecord lets you do that, right? Through its find by X method. So given a bunch of different attributes, you could just say, okay, find by first name, last name, whatever, right? So for example, I could have a user whose last name is Dumbledore, and I want to find by his last name. I could also chain my find queries and say first name and email. So Dumbledore's first name is Albus, that's his email address, and I could just do that. Of course, there is this caveat, so to say, that it's now recommended to use scoped ActiveRecord finders as opposed to just using the find by methods directly. But it is an option, right? It is something you can do by, instead of defining all these methods on your classes, Rails just gives it to you out of the box. So some of the magic that metaprogramming gives you, it lets you add dynamic finders, like ActiveRecord uses them. It could let you add behavior to your classes dynamically, and you could potentially build your own DSLs, right? Pretty straightforward. For example, say I had to write a DSL that generates an HTML file or an HTML text that looks something like this. My DSL could potentially look something like, I write a fancy markup and I define it that way. And using metaprogramming, using method missing, I could just do it like that. It still looks like HTML, but it's written in Ruby, and there's a lot more I can do with it now. Spec is a very popular example of a Ruby DSL for testing. So that was a little bit to start with about metaprogramming in Ruby. Another thing that I've had to do at least a few times in the past is to iterate over a list with custom algorithms, right? So I want to define an algorithm that runs over a list, but it's only used once, so I don't want to write a brand new method for it. For example, one very simple example would be just to find something on a list that fulfills a particular criteria, right? And Ruby lets me do that, and in fact, by default, array would let you do that, and it's a common use case of the yield keyword, right? Given an array, you want to find something. Here, your array class now does what it does best, which is just iterating over its own elements, and the responsibility for doing whatever you're expecting it to do, or to figuring out what you need to find, the actual implementation, is now delegated back to your application code. So it lets you delegate the right actions to the right actors. So that's another example of metaprogramming that Ruby lets you do. So that was a little bit about metaprogramming. Like I said, it might be a refresher for most of you. These are some of the things that I initially found very, very fascinating about Ruby, which is why I'm talking about them here. Moving on, say I have a class called Hogwarts Student, and attributes are name, friends, the house they belong to, and say I had this user who's a Hogwarts student called Draco Malfoy, and for now, list of friends is empty. Could be. So I want to be, if I'm writing, say, an RSpec test for it, then I expect to say, okay, expect user's friends to be empty, or alternatively, if I like Draco, which I do a little bit, to not be empty, right? At the same time, I want to say test if this user is in the house Slytherin. So I say expect user's house to equal Slytherin. But I don't like the way it's written. Instead, I want to be able to say, well, expect user to be in Slytherin because it's much more readable. One of the most important, or for me, the most interesting features of Ruby is that it reads like English, and this reads more like English as opposed to saying expect something to equal something, especially in this case. So RSpec lets you do that through the magic of predicate matches, right? Say if you were doing it, if you were testing something on a list, you could test whether the list is empty or not empty, but you could also do the same thing with a bunch of different predicates. So, for example, if you have a predicate around, you have 0, you have empty, you have has key or has value alternatively, you could write pretty straightforward tests for all of them using RSpec, right? So expect 7 not to be 0, expect 0 to be 0, expect a list with a single element to not be empty, expect an empty list to be empty, and similar stuff. So a predicate is a Ruby method that returns a Boolean value and by convention has a question mark at the end of it, right? But that's not all. It also lets you write custom matches. So say we have the same user and I'm trying to test if the user is in Slytherin. I could write a matcher that is defined in this manner. So I can say it's an RSpec matcher that is be in Slytherin, and it internally calls the method, the predicate method in Slytherin on the user class. So yeah, I mean, thanks to Ruby, that's something you can do as well. You can just define your own custom matches, and I come from a school of thought where your tests are the documentation of your code, right? And this pretty much documents what I'm trying to do with my code as opposed to something else, and it makes my code so much more easier for the person who's coming back and reading it to actually figure out what it's trying to do. All right, moving on. I'm a lazy developer, so to say, right? So I like to write as little code as possible while getting the job done. So something like this, if there was a shorter way to write it, I would use it. Is anyone familiar with a shorter way of writing that? Yeah. All right, few people are. For those of you who might not be, you could potentially write that. So all you're doing here is saying, okay, here's my list, I want to do a map action, and I just want to be able to do it by calling the 2s method on each of these, right? So you have the shorthand functions, and I'm trying to be funny here by using fn instead of function, which when I was dry running some of this with my colleagues, they said, I think you misspelled function there. Like, no, that's meant to be funny. But anyway, clearly it isn't because I'm having to explain that joke. So that comes out of the symbol2proc implementation, right? So the implementation in Rails looks something like this. You have, inside the symbol class, you have a method called toProc, which implicitly gets called when you use a unary ampersand in front of a method call, or rather symbol for a method call. And it converts it into a proc object, which is essentially a way of passing around blocks of code around in your application. And it calls send on itself, and the one thing here is the Rails. Clearly, super excited. Alright, the Rails implementation lets you pass around multiple arguments. So you could potentially write something like, this list inject, you're calling the multiply operation here, and it gives you the result 180, which is essentially a multiplication of these values. But say you didn't really want multiple arguments. In that case, you would use something different, which would probably look like, just convert it into a new proc object and do the implementation, do the action on that particular one. Reason being that, at least from what I read, the implementation with multiple arguments is about, I think, 3 times slower than the one that doesn't need multiple arguments. So from what I read, it is, no, it's not from what I read, it is true. Similar to proc is now a native Ruby implementation, right? So you could just use it if you don't need multiple arguments, then this would be a much better implementation to use as opposed to the Rails implementation. Right. So, moving on, talking a little more about RSpec. So, say this is my test. responds to foo. And I create a new user object and say, okay, expect user to respond to foo. Fairly straightforward test, but at the same time, if you look at it, it's repeating a few things. And again, I don't like to repeat myself, which I just did, but at the same time, I like to repeat as little of my code as possible as well. So, big fan of the try principle. And I can see that I'm doing that. I'm having to write my class name multiple times. I'm having to say respond to foo a few times. Instead, thanks to the fact that our spec supports dry specs, you can just write it as it is expected to respond to foo as long as you have your class name in your describe, and it would create a new instance and call it implicitly on that instance. Alternatively, maybe you would like to, define specifically what user you want to run your test on. So you could say let user is say morning module. You define the subject for this particular describe block is user, and then you write your test. So it's expected to respond to a certain method. And the good thing here is that this gets evaluated only when you actually use it, only when you actually write your example or your spec, and that leads to the lazy evaluation aspect of our spec, that your let and your subject gets implemented. So you say you run this example, it says, okay, so is there a subject defined? Looks like there is a subject defined, which is user. Okay, why is user defined? So user is defined here, and only then your user gets created, and your spec is lazily evaluated. So, in summary, what I talked about was metaprogramming, more specifically just method missing and the yield keyword. I spoke about predicate matches, dynamic predicate matches, and custom matches in our spec. I spoke about shorthand notations for functions, especially list functions, and I spoke about dry specs and lazy evaluation in our spec. This is by no means the best list that could ever be. This is by no means an exhaustive list of what Ruby lets you do. But at the same time, for me, these were all these new magical things that I was discovering when I started working with Ruby. Because for a long time, I'd been working on C and C++, especially during school and college. Found it quite cumbersome to use. And for some reason, I by default hated statically typed languages. I've used them a lot, but never a big fan. So another big thing about Ruby, it's dynamically typed, which is amazing. So these are a few of the things that when I discovered were really cool to me and I found really cool. So this is not so much a talk about what you love about Ruby, but more about what I love about Ruby. That was just to mislead you into wanting to hear my talk. So to sort of wrap up everything, again in the words of DHH, Ruby was like finding a magical glove that just fit my brain perfectly, better than I had ever imagined a glove fitting. And when I read this, I just like, yes, that is the code I'm going to use in my talk, because it just makes sense, and it was true for me at least. I don't know how many of you actually identify with it. I did, definitely. So that was it. That's all I had to say on the things I love about Ruby, and hopefully you do too. For those of you who are already, of course, quite familiar with Ruby and Rails, hopefully this served as a bit of a back to basics lesson. If it did, well, I'm done talking, so thank you. My name is Isha Tripathi. That's my email ID if you ever want to get in touch, or if you're in India, do get in touch. I'd be happy to sort of show you around a little bit if I can. I'm on Twitter as Tripathi Isha, and that's it. Thank you.
Do you have any questions for Isha? Now's the time.
You can also ask me questions about Harry Potter, just in case you didn't realize.
Why do you think you're a beginner if you understood all those concepts?
I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I think I'm loud enough.
So, hi Isha. I have a comment and I have a question. So, the comment is, this is something I learned before also. So, when people talk about method missing a lot, but I think it's also very important to know about response to missing. Because as you know, if an object responds to a method, you expect respond to return true, right? But the problem is if the method works with method missing, responds to returns false.
Right.
So you'll need to also handle it in response to missing. And so my question is, so like I learned about that. So what things did you learn that, of course, before I don't know why it doesn't work. So, yeah. I'm sorry, the question is, what are the things that were difficult to wrap your head into?
There were quite a few, especially coming from like a more traditional programming background, right? Especially, so things like method missing, they look like, oh, that's awesome. I can just implement a method missing and everything works. But I think some of the things I struggled most hard with was, what is the right place to use certain things like that, which especially those that look like silver bullets, right? So you just use it and it's done. But knowing and understanding how and when to use those, which honestly I don't really completely do so far, but just having that ability to see if, are you just trying to oversimplify a solution or even sometimes over-engineer it in order to fit, one of the awesome programming caveats that there are, or do you actually need it right now? So that's, I guess, I know it's a very vague answer, but that is something I struggle with most when moving into a different paradigm of programming. All right, thank you very much.